I'm going to say a little bit more. I hope I'm not totally speaking out of line, but there's a beautiful, you know what? I'm going to say this while the kids are being dismissed. So if you are between the ages of grade 5 and grade 12, you are dismissed and be blessed as you go. Just a quick word. This is part of the story for Brent Michelle that many of you know, but some of you do not. They went down to Nicaragua under the umbrella of a ministry called Engineering Ministries International. Is that what EMI stands for? Yeah. So EMI. And you heard reference made to EMI in the video. So it was this interesting thing. I still remember praying with Brent Michelle. It's like, okay, we're excited about going down. We know we've been called. But I know that Michelle went with a little fear and trepidation, like, well, what am I going to do? She wasn't going as a trained project manager or anything. She was going down there. She would have to find a ministry. Well, what ended up happening is she found the local dump, and she just started spending time with these people, praying for them, caring for their most basic needs. And it became this thriving ministry. They discovered Mango through a friend, a doctor friend, right, I think, and started making those visits. Well, as it turned out, Brent ended up leaving EMI, and they poured themselves full-time into these ministries at the dump and in Mango. And I love how God brings it full circle. Here they are, they've been donated a bit of land, and they've got these big visions for a school, and all of a sudden EMI calls you guys, right? And says, hey, we've had a couple of projects fall through, do you have anything for us to do? And they're like, well, it just so happens, we've just been donating some land and we need a school. And so I had seen those pictures, that video of them working on that. I think it's the coolest thing that the kids were a part of designing their dream school. I just think that's super cool. So just God does his thing in beautiful ways. And thank you for giving us a lens into what he's doing in Nicaragua. And you bless us with that. And again, just want to echo what Brent's already said, that if you can give, you won't regret it. This is one of those things, I love having direct partnerships with people whose feet are on the ground, so that we know that when you give a dollar gets to this ministry. There isn't this filtering off of administrative fees and taxes and things it goes directly to the kids, and I think it's a beautiful thing. So thank you. You do not need to run my little introduction video because I'm already flying through this, right? Okay, I gotta watch the time because we still want to spend some time in worship at the end of this. Oh, we're doing great. So I can tell you my story from this morning. I was a little bleary-eyed this morning, a little foggy, woke up and wanted to make myself presentable, so I got my deodorant, uncapped it, and I forgot that it was a brand new stick of deodorant. It still had that plastic razor sharp thing on it. That woke me up. So I slashed the inside of my pits. And this is terrible. Feeling sorry for myself, so I took the cap off and then I put that over top of what I just sprayed and put it all over again. And I'm like, this is exactly what we're preaching on today. And I'm not saying that I made up what we're preaching on today based on my armpit story. I'm saying today, the big idea, I'm going to skip 2 slides forward, the big idea is that we need to be on guard, not right guard, but on guard and watchful of our theology. We need to pay attention. I wasn't paying attention. It reminded me, how many of you are old enough to know who Larry Norman is? You can, yeah, there you go, good. Larry Norman sang a song. I've never really sung for you guys before. Should I sing for you? Yeah. Woo! So, how if I just tell you the lyrics? Now I'm embarrassed. This Mama killed a chicken. She thought it was a duck. She put it on the table with the legs sticking up. Papa broke his glasses when he fell down drunk. Tried to drown the kitty cat. Turned out to be a skunk. You gotta watch what you're doing. And it's all, this song is about, it actually goes into some pretty deep theological things, where you need to pay attention to your life. You need to keep it in proper alignment, because if you go off the path bit by bit by bit, you're going to find yourself well off the path in a dangerous spot. So whether you are putting on deodorant or watching your theology, you need to pay attention. That's the message for today. You go back a slide and give you a picture of where we are today. Today we are in Thyatira. Thyatira is a little farther inland. It is it's the least of all of these cities and churches that are having letters written to them. Again, I know you know this because we've been teaching on it for the last little bit, but what we're about to visit in the Word is a revelation given to John. John has been banished to the island of Patmos for preaching the Word, for teaching about Jesus. He's been banished, essentially imprisoned on this island. And God comes to him, and Jesus is speaking to him, telling him, write this letter to these churches. And again, it was ended up being one document that would have been circulated to all 7 of these churches in what is current Turkey, so Western Asia. And Thyatira was one of those churches in a very small, it would have been a small congregation in a smaller city. But they were very much embracing this Rome worship. They were part of the Roman Empire, and very much, I was preaching on Smyrna a few weeks ago. And Smyrna was like the hub, right on the coast. So all of the trade routes kind of merged in Smyrna, and they were a very affluent, wealthy city. And the church as well. Well, actually, the church was not, because they were kind of ostracized. In the same way, Thyatira embraced Roman rule. They celebrated, they went so far as to worship Roman leaders. But they were a smaller city, a less significant city. And that's all I kind of want to say about Thyatira. We need to be on guard, watch for our theology. Here's the beginning of Revelation 2:18. And to the angel of the church in Thyatira write the words of the Son of God, who has eyes like a flame of fire, and whose feet are burnished like bronze. These are very intentional descriptors of Jesus presenting this vision and telling John what to write. These eyes like a flame of fire, it's symbolic of his understanding, this piercing vision that Jesus has, that he can see right through our soul. He has access to know everything about us. That flame, it refines, it burns away everything that isn't good and leaves what's left that is good. So there's this, again, I think of it almost like X-ray vision of our soul. That's what his eyes like a flame of fire. And his feet are like burnished bronze. I didn't know this about bronze. But bronze is, it's a very strong substance. In fact, in this day and age, it would have been one of the strongest, sturdiest metals. And it goes through a really extensive refining process to become really pure and strong. And so when he talks about his feet like burnished bronze, he's talking about how his footing is solid. And I needed to take a moment, and I hope I don't go off on too much of a rabbit trail here. I want to talk about this idea of keeping watch on your theology and understanding also Jesus' established footing that is unwavering. Watching your theology can be a tricksy thing because there are a couple of extremes, and you know you might be these people. There are people who are very flighty when it comes to their theology, and they hold theology very lightly. Theology, by the way, is the study of God and learning and understanding who God is. Some people hold their theology very lightly, and their ideas can kind of be blown around and changed with the weather. You'll hear people talk about karma in the church. Okay? And so some people are just kind of open to everything. And then on the other hand, you get these people, and their faces are usually like this all the time, and they know everything about everything, and their heels are like also burnished bronze, stuck in, dug in, and they want to fight you about every theological issue because they've got it figured out, and they're not going to waver from that point. So I want to present to you that there is a spectrum. When we're talking about people, there is a spectrum. that goes from the flighty to the ferocious. Now, when it comes to Jesus, he describes his feet like burnished bronze. He is stuck in. And you know what? He's allowed to be stuck in. You know why? He knows everything. He actually does understand God because he is God. So for him to have these feet like burnished bronze, where he is completely stuck in, his theology is 100% like non-negotiable, that makes sense. But let me give you a little bit of a word of caution. I find that in these extremes with people, we need to be very careful. We need to attend to our theology. And either extreme starts to drift into dangerous spots. If we're open to everything, we're going to get tripped up. We're going to read about that today. We're going to get tripped up. And we're going to fall for some very dangerous stuff. If we dig in and plant our flag and declare that we know everything about theology, and we're not moving off it, and we'll argue it to our death, there is also a danger there. Because there are some theological issues that are wrestled with today by amazing, God-fearing men and women. And there are differences of opinion on some theological issues. And so we need to hold that a little bit more lightly. And there's a balance to be had. I know this is dangerous on the heels of Jordan preaching about the Church of Compromise last week. And I'm not talking about a compromise. Ultimately, by saying we should be planting our flag and sticking our heels in theologically, we're not saying that God is any less perfect. We're saying that we're going to humble ourselves and say that we're not perfect. That we probably haven't figured out everything yet. And so we're not going to argue to the death. Okay, I didn't want to go off on that much of a rabbit trail. That's just the first verse. That's Revelation 2:18. Verse 19 says this. Again, this is the voice of Jesus meant for the people of Thyatira. It says, I know your works, your love and faith and service and patient endurance, and that your latter works exceed the first. Let me look at that list. Love and faith, service, and patient endurance. Once again, oh my goodness, oh to have God write this about Northridge. I can't imagine a greater feeling than to have these qualities acknowledged about the local church. For him to see and know everything and to point these things out as attributes of the Church of Thyatira is, man, it's got to be a pastor's dream. Oh, how I would love if the people of Maple Ridge, in the same breath as they say, Northridge, oh man, that's the church that loves, that is full of faith, that serves the community with patient endurance. Can you imagine if that was our reputation? What a beautiful thing to have said about them. And then he goes one step further. That's why I've highlighted this. Your latter works exceed the first. You're only getting better. The more recent things you've done are even better than where you started. So you're trending in a more loving, more faithful, greater service, and even more patient endurance way. It's a beautiful start to what Jesus has to say about the Church of Thyatira. But I have this against you. Here's the bad news. This is kind of the pattern in these letters to churches. There's this exhortation and encouragement. Good job. Keep going. But wait a minute. There's this. And here's the point of correction that God has for the Church of Thyatira. I have this against you, that you tolerate that woman Jezebel who calls herself a prophetess and is teaching and seducing my servants to practice sexual immorality and to eat food sacrificed to idols. It's a lot. I've highlighted Jezebel. This is not the actual Jezebel that we hear about in the Old Testament. Jezebel in the Old Testament was drawing men and women in to worship Baal. So this is a Jezebel. It's a woman identified as doing the same sort of thing. Drawing believers away from God and drawing them into sinful idolatry. There are some students who will tell you that this Jezebel might have actually been the pastor of Thyatira, his wife. So imagine Carolee right now. Actually, I'm going to get you to imagine Carolee in just a moment, but that there's this thought in commentaries that this might have been the pastor's wife who was drawing the people of the church into idolatry. One of the things you need to understand culturally is there were these guilds set up and established throughout the land and the map that we showed you earlier. And these guilds were almost like these clubs. And most often clubs for men. And they would come in and they'd have probably secret handshakes, but they would do these perverse, sexually immoral things in this club. And sometimes they form these clubs and they would do them in the name of improving the community, of getting together and like, yeah, we're going to make this a better place. And in the meanwhile, we're going to do all these awful things as well. And it just seems ridiculous that these people who want to be children of God, who want to serve Jesus, that they could get sucked into this. But this church is being outed. It says, I have this against you, that you tolerate that woman Jezebel. You allow her to draw people out of worshiping me and into worship of idols and doing these sexually immoral things. And again, it seems weird, like the thought of if somebody rose up in this church and said, hey, let's go down to this club over here and worship idols and do freaky things and stuff like that. Our radar hopefully would be high enough that we wouldn't fall into that trap. But let me paint a different picture. First of all, this is completely fiction. I'm going to use my wife as an example. This is completely fiction. All right? Actually, let me tell you a quick story. And I don't want to confuse things, but I think this might help. Yesterday, our family was at an award ceremony for my second son, Connor. And it was at Basalt Motors on Fraser Highway in Surrey. So he had won this scholarship, and so there was this big to-do. And they had dignitaries from all over the place. John Abbott from TSN 1040 was there. They flew in this premier from India to speak and to present an award. It was a big deal. And it was very interesting. I was very much a minority. Our family was very much a minority as far as our skin color was. It wasn't an exclusively Sikh event, but it was a predominantly Sikh attended event. And it was culturally, it was a stretch for us. I've only recently discovered the joy of samosas. Those are good. Actually, I have to confess, we saw the samosas first. They were free. So I had to have samosas. And then I noticed there was a White Spot food truck there, and it was free. So I had to have a legendary cheeseburger and a Coke. I don't know what I'm talking about. Oh, the point is this. It felt culturally different. But I'll tell you what. I loved their vision for community. It was beautiful. And over this message of understanding that this community they were in, had blessed this car dealership with service. And they were doing very well financially. So the only logical thing to do was now to give that back to the community. And they felt very strongly it was important to give to these young students these scholarships. It's a beautiful message. Now, this is where I don't want to kind of muddle things. Imagine if my wife, the pastor's wife, and those of you who know my wife love my wife, imagine if she found a new place. She hosts the prayer meetings on the Fridays. Imagine if she found a new place to do prayer. And she says, it's a beautiful space. Just come on in. So you get there, and they say, okay, you need to take your shoes off, and then take your left sock off, and then we're going to, I'm making this up as I go, we need to paint your toenails on your left foot only, and then we will just put some spices on your forehead, and then what we ask you to do just before you go into the prayer room is just if you could just bow down before this picture, and it's just cultural, and you move on, and can you imagine those of you who know my wife are probably like, some of you would just think, okay, if Carolee says it's okay, it's probably okay. Again, completely fictional story. But imagine if Carolee had bad intentions and she was drawing you out, and again, this is a fictitious religion or cult I was describing too. Imagine if she's drawing you into something that was idol worship and something outside of what God has for us. And it becomes a little easier to understand how the people of Thyatira would get sucked in by this prominent woman who was in the church and who was distracting people. Again, this is probably not going to be a daily concern for us to wrestle with. But it is a reminder that we need to pay attention to our theology. We need to pay attention to our walk and to know how we need to walk through it. Let me read a little more. Revelation 2:21-22 goes on to talk about this Jezebel. He says, I gave her time to repent, but she refuses to repent of her sexual immorality. Behold, I will throw her onto a sick bed, and those who commit adultery with her I will throw into great tribulation, unless they repent of her works. And I will strike her children dead, and all the churches will know that I am he who searches mind and heart, that those eyes of flame. And I will give to each of you according to your works. Sounds super harsh, right? This is pretty extreme, but he's saying we need to be on guard. This is important. And I do like how he includes, I gave her a chance. I've made it clear to her that what she's doing is wrong, but she refuses to repent. She continues to draw people out of faith. Mark 9, verse 42 says this. Whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a great millstone were hung around his neck and he were thrown into the sea. You know that I taught for many years. In fact, I still teach some classes on the side. And as a teacher, I'm pretty relaxed. I always had this saying, if I teach a kid that 3 + 3 is 12, they're going to figure it out later down the road. It's not that, math isn't that big a deal, right? No amens? Okay. But honestly, I felt like I was an effective teacher, but I didn't lose sleep over if I drew a map and I put Oklahoma in the wrong spot, right? I didn't lose a lot of sleep over that. But I'll tell you something, there's something about preaching that you do it with a little bit of fear. And actually, we've got a lot of people in this room who have taken time behind the pulpit. We're very picky about who we have speak to the church. But they can tell you that when you do it, there's just a little bit of, there's a lot of awe and reverence, but a little bit of fear. Because the word says this, that if I tell you something, especially if I tell you from this highly esteemed metal music stand, if I tell you something that Jesus is saying to you today, and they're not God's words, they're my words, that's a dangerous thing. He says it'd be better if a great millstone were hung around my neck and be thrown into the sea. We're going to be judged very strictly. And I tell you this because it accentuates, it highlights just how important getting it right is to God. And so while I start at the beginning saying that there's a spectrum of flighty and firm when it comes to our theology, and while I would encourage you to reevaluate, if you find yourself in the firm, I've got it all figured out, I've stuck my flag in the ground and I'm going to fight to the death for it. If you find yourself there, I'm encouraging you to soften your stance, because you probably do have something to learn. At the same time, we should all be pointed this way. Our heart inclination, our heart direction, our mind pursuit should be to knowing God better, to this pursuit of pure theology. And I'll tell you what, church, there are so many influences available to us today. There are so many different directions. I find myself almost lost when it comes to going on YouTube and seeing different people preach. There are just so many people who are anointed and gifted preachers. And then there are so many people who are good preachers, but I don't know them well enough. I don't always take the time to measure what they're saying up against God's standard. And it could be easy to be led off track. Herein lies the takeaway for today. I'm actually going to skip, and I'm going to call the worship team to come back up. Here's the takeaway. It's one thing to stumble. As we pursue this correct understanding of God, it's one thing if we get off track, if we allow ourselves to lose track of our theology and to go off track. That's one thing. But oh my goodness, it's quite another thing to cause someone else to stumble. And we need to be careful. This is why I'm telling you, if you stick your flag in the ground, and if you claim to have cornered the market on sound theology, you better be darn sure that you've got God's word that you're sharing. You know what? I have to do this sometimes. There are some times where there is just truth, and we can't avoid it. And sometimes that truth can be harsh. But at the same time, there are a lot of things, there are a lot of fights and debates that either I can't engage in. I got to tell you a really quick story. I had a question just this week via Facebook Messenger. Pastor David, what do you think about women in ministry? And specifically women in leadership in the church. I'm like, oh my goodness, this is a fun one. And we had to have this conversation about what the Word says. We had to have this conversation about the character of God. And it was this incredibly beautiful exchange of ideas. But that was one of those examples where I didn't want to be the person to say, I have figured it all out. So that was kind of how I started things. Like, this is one of those things I wrestle with still today. This is one of those things that I don't feel confident to preach from the pulpit just yet. As firm. I've got more digging to do. And then we had that discussion. I sidetracked myself a little bit there. But there are times when we have to know the truth. There are some pillars of faith. Some things that can't be debated. Some non-negotiables. But then there are a lot of things that can be pursued a little bit more. We just need to be careful. Because it's quite another thing to cause someone else to stumble by saying we've got it figured out and putting our words into God's words. All right. That was quite a jumbled ending. I'm sorry. Here's how we're going to finish things. We get to come before the King of Kings. We get to come before the one who we know has it all figured out. The Alpha and the Omega, the one who knows the beginning and the end. The one with eyes like flame, who can pierce our heart and know everything about us. We get to come before him humbly and sing these songs of praise and worship to him. So we're going to sing, and then I'll just come and close right here. All right? Let's sing. Worthy to be praised. Have a quick seat. I want to put a bow on this. Man, I love those last two songs of that kind of little theological journey it took us on. Starting with the power in the blood. It's about Jesus' blood and what he's done. That's central. That is one of those core beliefs that we have, that it's all about Jesus. If you wouldn't mind actually putting the lyrics of the word cornerstone, not the word cornerstone, but the song cornerstone, there's another part in here that I think really puts a bow on what we're trying to talk about theology. It's important that we attend to our theology. And what it is this posture of learning more about the Father. But the why of why we learn about the Father is essential as well. If you want to read all the books and study your Bible so that you can win every argument, you've missed the point. But if you want to study all the books and read the Bible because you want to know the Father, then you've nailed it. You've nailed it. And there's this, do you mind just going next slide? Next slide. Next slide. We'll get there eventually. Next slide. I'll recognize when I see it. Next slide. Next slide. There we are. Ultimately, no matter how well we know God, no matter how well we know His Word, ultimately the reason we can stand before Him, the reason we don't die in His presence, is because we have been washed in the blood, because of what Jesus has done. And our role, our job is really just to tether ourselves and cling to Jesus and be thankful that He has saved us. And it's for that reason that we can stand before the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, faultless, clothed and washed in the purity of His blood. So here's the takeaway for this week. As we go, let's pursue knowledge and learning of the Father. Let's pursue a relationship with Him like we've never done before. But let's not do it so that we can look good. Let's do it so we can know better the one that we should know. All right, be blessed, and we'll see you next week. Oh, next week we're dedicating a baby. So come ready for the cuteness. All right, see you next week.